Welcome to 80s TV Ladies, part of the Weirding Way Media Network.
80s TV ladies, so sexy and so pretty. 80s TV ladies, stepping out into the city. 80s TV ladies, often treated kind of working hard for the money in a man's world. 80s TV ladies.
Welcome to 80s TV Ladies, where we examine female-driven television shows from the 1980s. Here are your hosts, Sharon Johnson and Susan Lambert-Haddam.
Hey guys, I'm Sharon. And when I was growing up, my favorite comic books were Archie comics. I can't say that I've read any since then, although I am aware of some. But yeah, I was an Archie girl.
That's so funny. Do you watch Riverdale?
I do not.
I
Because
don't either.
it's so,
Not Archie,
yeah.
but it's Archie apparently.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'm Susan, and my favorite comic books from the 80s were the ones I read when I got to visit my cousin Mark in Mississippi, and he had a stack of them in his closet. The Amazing Spider-Man, Justice League, X-Men, Wolverine, and of course, I personally collected the first 10 Star Wars issues, which I still have today in a box in my closet.
I'm really a little astonished that as a Star Wars super fan that I wasn't aware that there were any Star Wars comics to be collected at that time. So I have none.
Oh, yes, there were.
Are they worth anything?
Well, probably not, because I actually, if they were in perfect condition, then maybe they would be worth like a couple $1,000. But they're not in perfect condition. I was 11. I read them and kept them in a drawer, not in sealed plastic, and then I stuck them in a box. But they're worth a lot to me.
Well, that's what you're supposed to do with things like that. I don't know. Read them. That seems to be what the purpose is, not stick them in hermetically sealed plastic or whatever.
I guess some people read them and then stuck them in hermetically sealed plastic because they wanted to be precious about it. But I wasn't that.
I read a lot of books. I had a huge collection of, at school, you'd be able to order books through the catalog and stuff. I had tons and tons of books.
They still have that. Now it's gone online. But in the early days when our youngest was in elementary school, they still sent home the little magazine thing going, here's all the books you can get. And here's all the toys you can get with it now, because that's what they did to it. But what was that called?
I can't for the life of me remember. Oh my gosh.
I remember the Riff Mobile. Remember Reading is Fundamental?
Mm-mm.
Oh, I do remember Reading is Fundamental, but I don't think they sent a mobile around to us.
It was like a mobile, library that you could go in and look at a book.
Well, I was very lucky. I remember at one point when we were living overseas, the library was literally across the street. I spent a lot of time over there.
That is lucky.
Checking out books. It was awesome.
The Scholastic Book Club.
Oh, nice.
And you'd get those little, oh my God, I love that. And circling the ones that I wanted. Oh,
I had the Highlights magazine.
I love the
Oh, yeah, it
highlights.
was awesome. I think that's still around too.
It is still around. Goofus and Gallant. Wasn't that highlights?
Don't remember them.
I don't remember it that well.
Oh, well, it would because Goofus was always kind of a jerk and Gallant was really nice and polite and,
And gallant.
helped people. And gallant, yes. It's got to be.
Do those old television Christian animes count?
Oh, yeah.
Gumby? Does Gumby count as a cartoon?
Yeah.
But I also watched Captain Scarlet.
Wow. I don't remember either
Captain
of those
Scarlet.
things.
I don't
thought
remember Captain Scarlet at all.
Would Mad Magazine be considered? Well, it's not really a comic book, but there was a lot of animation.
There was a
in it.
lot of
And
cartoon,
a lot of
Yeah.
drawings and stuff in it.
I would
Alright.
count
Love
it as a graphic
Yeah.
Yeah.
I
publication.
love Mad Magazine.
Love Mad Magazine. Yeah, I did love them. I love a lot of graphic novels now, but don't read as many comic books. But it's big. And there's a lot of television shows that were based on comic books and a lot of comic books that are based on television shows. But anyway, today we're going to actually talk to a comic book maker and television writer and producer and filmmaker. And so we're going to talk to him about television and, you guessed it, comic books. We have an awesome special guest today, my friend and amazing writer, Bryan Edward Hill.
Bryan graduated from NYU Film School. His TV and film writing includes HBO's Titans, Ash vs. Evil Dead, and The Legend of Muay Thai 9 Satra.
For comics, he's written for Black Panther, Fallen Angels, American Carnage, Angel and Spike, and Chariot, among many, many others, DC, Marvel, and independent publishers.
Welcome, Bryan, to 80s TV Ladies.
Thank you for having me. It's a joy to be here.
I am so happy to have you on because you've been so supportive of the show and you're a friend. And so it's really a treat to have you on.
Well, I just thought the show was a wonderful idea. Since I'm a fellow that grew up largely in the 80s, there's some 90s in there somewhere, but we don't talk about that.
Don't talk about the 90s.
And, I grew up in a single parent household raised by my mother. So, dimensionalized, strong female characters, huge part of my childhood. And so that intersection of that and the 80s, I couldn't resist.
So we know each other because we met through my husband, Richard Haddam, because you guys have spent the last 4 to 5 years working on HBO Titans together.
We have indeed, the unsinkable Richard Haddam. And it's been wonderful. That whole experience, it's speaking of television briefly, it's just so interesting because you spend the same time working on a show that you would spend in like graduate school, and it sort of feels a little bit like college or graduate school as well, because the hiatus, then you come back and then you're back in class and, who got a haircut, who got new shoes.
I had never made the correlation before, but that's exactly right.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's just like that. It's just like that.
That is so fantastic. And then it's like, okay, well, who's back and who's new? Who transferred in?
Who's new?
Who left?
Don't let them sit by themselves at lunch. That would be rude. Like all of those different things.
Oh my God. I love that because it's like, it is. Yeah. And, and you're hoping you make it, through the 4-5 years of grad school.
One hopes. One certainly hopes.
And then you can start another grad school later.
And then you can start another grad school. Once you get into that kind of mindset, I guess it never stops, right?
Yes, it's true. I mean, that's what this show is I had something to say, but also a lot of questions and that I wanted answers. So I'm giving myself a grad school in 80s TV Ladies.
So, Bryan, let's go back and kind of start at the beginning. Where are you from,
Sure.
and how did you get to Hollywood?
Originally, I am from St. Louis, Missouri, and I went to NYU, and so I spent about 10, 12 years or so in New York. And then I came out to Hollywood when I sold a screenplay. So because I was poor in St. Louis and I was poor in New York, I was determined not to be poor in every major American city. So I didn't move to Los Angeles until I had sold something, so I could come out and not have any memories of top ramen on the West Coast. And I don't have any, I'm very proud to say.
That is fantastic. I love that. We could just spend hours talking about being poor in New York because I don't.
Certainly.
My hat's off to you because that's not a city that is cheap.
Not at all.
It's not.
Was it always your goal to be a writer for television or movies?
I would love to tell you it was, Sharon, but it really wasn't. My goal was really to make a lot of money and not have to grow up. And so I searched in high school for something that would allow me to do that was keyed into a passion, right? And so storytelling was always a comfort for me. Stories were just always very important to me, kind of helped me frame myself. I talk about stories as the last vestige of philosophy we have in culture. It's very difficult to get someone, 16, 15, 14 to read Aristotle or Marcus Aurelius, but you can present these ideas in fiction. So since I was an 80s media baby, basically, I was of the, try not, do or do not, there is no try, right?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few.
Or the one. Yes.
Right. So these things were really important to me. And then as I was kind of charting a course through life, I didn't want to be the interesting guy with a cubicle and a Spider-Man tie. That was always the fun guy to be around at the office party. That didn't seem like the way for me. So I was like, well, writing is interesting. I have some facility with words. I'm interested in the human condition. And I went to NYU to be a filmmaker as well, because I loved film too. Writing was easier, so I just did more writing. And then when I came out of NYU, I intended to write to fund my filmmaking career. And then I got seduced by the ability to make money in an air-conditioned room without lugging equipment up flights of stairs. And so writing became more of a passion from that point on. And that's kind of how I landed in Hollywood. I just threw a bunch of things at the system, and 99.9% of them came right back to me, but one of them got in, and then I got things started, and so on and so forth.
So when did the comic books, what came first? Comic books, television, film, It
was sort of all simultaneous. I mean, when I was a kid, you could get a Snickers bar, a Slurpee, and a comic book for about $5, right? So they were impulse buys. And they were some of the first things I bought with my own money, right? I mean, you can't really buy this and that, but you sort of cherish the things you can, buy with your lawn mowing money. And just kind of love them as stories. And then my father died when I was 7. And so I struggled with that, like any young man would. And I just found a real affinity with Bruce Wayne. And that really bonded me towards Batman and then comics writ large. In a lot of ways, it kind of bonded me to fiction in general. I mean, this is a whole different podcast we could talk about how I was raised by fictional fathers, because I had no idea what masculinity was. I knew it was some kind of combination of Indiana Jones, James Bond, and Bruce Wayne, and I would figure it out somehow, right? So they were all, comics were a really important thing for me. And then the interesting thing is, as I grew older, the writing got more layered and more dimensional. See, a bunch of British writers came in and did really strong work in the space.
So in the 70s and 80s, was this happening?
In the 80s, in the 80s, like mid 80s, when the Alan Moores and the Neil Gaimans and the Grant Morrisons showed up, right? Frank Miller. And so as I was growing older and seeking more nuance, these stories also grew in nuance. And they also sort of framed how I looked at female characters in fiction, because, comics are replete with interesting, dimensionalized heroines and villains and all of that. It's sort of like a unique sort of landscape in that way. When you combine that with James Cameron movies and what have you, I mean, how I arrived is pretty apparent. So yeah, as I, kind of grew older and started writing as a pursuit, comics were interesting to me to do. A bit opaque how one does them. But once I opened up a few doors in Hollywood, I suddenly became more attractive to comics. Imagine that. And then I started working in comics. And to this day, I still, write comics on a semi-regular basis. And I write feature screenplays. And I also write and produce television.
So you keep busy.
I try to. Idle hands. I do try to keep myself fairly busy. I was the only child. So I grew up having to keep myself busy, I think. And I think you just never lose the knack of that.
And so when you were watching television, what sort of 80s driven shows or particularly 80s driven female shows do you remember and were informational to you?
I have to say a lot of it has to do with people I had crushes on. Sorry to disappoint.
No, that's where a lot of things start.
Exactly.
Magnum PI, whatever.
It was like Scarecrow and Mrs. King because I had a crush on Kate Jackson. And we could be here for 8 hours talking about Jane Badler in V.
Oh,
yeah.
Oh,
yes.
Right.
V.
And Faye Grant. Right.
Yes.
Susan Day and L.A. Law, Jackie Harry on 227. Like I was just getting my heart broken across television most of the 80s, So I think some of that still left an impression on me. Like even when I come up with comic book characters, sometimes they'll come out like Patricia McPherson from Knight Rider, who played Bonnie, right?
Yeah.
Like Stephanie Zimbalist, will still kind of show up in the iconography, as it were. Marilyn McCoo will show up.
I love that.
So, that's the thing of it. So that was my relationship because I was coming of age at the same time, and a lot of that is just formative, and it kind of burns its way into you.
Yeah, they're so beautiful too. Like you're watching, you're like, actors and actresses are so beautiful. There is something really amazing. Like I think about how much we adore actors, right? And we can kind of watch them do anything. And it's often a physical beauty. Mm-hmm. But it's also like, I think of Tyne Daly, who was very physically beautiful, but, also was sitting here and I was just like, I'll listen to you read the phone book. Literally, just please, whatever you want. You want to read the newspaper, come into my house every day and just read something out loud to me.
Yeah, just sit there and talk.
Just sit there
Whatever
and
you have
talk.
to- anything you want to say.
Because there's a real gift in that ability to, I still don't know how actors do it. I'm around actors all the time. I've directed actors. I've written for actors. I don't know how they do it.
Well, it was magical back then in a way that it isn't now, because you didn't have 24-hour social media access to celebrities, right? I mean, you had the shows they were on. If they were in movies, you had those movies. And then maybe you would have like Mary Hart on Entertainment Tonight that would do an interview or something. But you had very specific ways that you would experience these people. And it was the magic of them getting beamed, through a television set, in your grandmother's living room or, in your mother's apartment where the big TV was, and you'd sit there and you'd watch that. Right. So it was a kind of a different relationship, I think that we had back then than now. I'm kind of glad that, I never, could go onto Susan Day's Twitter feed like that, no, I didn't need that. You know what I mean? Like
that would have been too much. That would have broken some magic. It would have broken some magic.
Broken some magic. There are things I don't want to see Melody Anderson coming out of the gym. That's not interesting to me. Like I would rather just sort of watch things. Sybil Shepherd was just larger than life. Right. All those things. And so it's not that I think it's worse now, but I just think our relationship to media, celebrity, human iconography is different now than it was when I was growing up. And I think some of the inexorable quality of it all has been lost.
I mean, I appreciate, and I'm sure they do too, the ability of a, for lack of a better word, celebrity to be able to communicate what they want to communicate directly without the filters of publicists or studios or whatever. But at the same time, yeah, I do it does kind of take away from the magic of whatever it is that they do. Like Susan, sometimes it does seem like a magic trick, some of the things that some performers are able to do. So, but that does come back to the audience and their, at least from my standpoint, choice in terms of what they want to consume and how they want to consume it. But we're still kind of going through this phase of trying to figure all that out because this is so new that all this stuff is just out there. But in the 80s, no, that wasn't an option.
Yeah, you didn't have the expectation of access.
No. You were lucky if you got the TV Guide interview and the People magazine interview, right?
And it leaves an imprint on you too, Susan. Like, I've been very grateful to have met quite a few celebrities just through work, whether it's developing a script with someone or you're at some event and you meet someone and, you meet people that are, undoubtedly A-list famous, what have you. And it's, it's kind of a moment. It's cool, whatever, but it recedes. I'm pretty good. I'm pretty cool about all of it.
I bet you're pretty cool. I can see that.
I was at a comic book convention maybe about 3 years ago, and Aaron Gray was sitting next to me. And I didn't have the power of speech because it was different, right? Because that activated something in my lizard brain from being like 11 years old and watching Buck Rogers or something or Silver Spoons. And I just literally just could not. I think I stuttered in front of her. I mean, she was very lovely about it. I think she gave me a photograph.
No, but I hear what you're saying. I had a similar reaction, quite unexpected. I was at, some event, something or other, and suddenly saw Thomas Carter across the way and literally could not speak, could not move. And my friend Brittany was like, let's go say hello. I'm like, I can't, I don't, you just never know. And where that reaction is going to happen.
Yeah. It's just different. You can't sort of get that back. I mean, it's happened on occasion with, other folks, like you bump into Schwarzenegger or something. It's kind of hard to just take that one in stride. I've never worked with Tom Cruise, but I've known people that have worked with him, and I'm sure that's a moment, for sure. But yeah, it's those folks that that when you were a kid and it was all like just kind of impossibly real, but also fantastic at the same time, those feelings never leave you. And luckily, I've never had a bad experience.
That's great.
Awesome.
Meeting someone from that era, where it would, tarnish anything that I used to love growing up. And I've been really grateful for that as well. Everyone I've ever met who worked on those things, from when I was a kid and kind of growing through that has all been very, very kind and very, very patient, even though I'm sure they hear the same things over and over and over again. I'm sure Catherine Bach never wants to hear any more about how someone had a crush on her, right?
Yeah. Like when you're in that developing moment of your teen years and your young, early 20s, there's something really, you're looking for who you're going to follow, I think, or who, like, how do I behave in the world?
Right.
And who is going to inspire me? And like you said, the philosophy of our day is in our comics and stories.
Well, and that's why I think representation is so important. Because I know it is empirically from my own experience, because I grew up watching Linda Carter, right, as a kid. That opened up my mind to the perception of, a woman as a leader, a woman as a hero, right? A woman as someone that you would follow, virtuous reasons, the rest of it, right? So all these things leave an impression on you when you're young. And if you don't see those things playing out dramatically in our entertainment, it becomes harder to recognize the existence of those things in the real world, to champion those things in the real world, right? And it's influenced a lot of my writing to this day, still. Just kind of I never really had that barrier of gender when I thought about a hero or even a villain. Like whether we're talking about Linda Carter or Jane Badler, they were equally powerful, and left a deep impression on me, and it's something that I do consider a lot, when we sort of, people get into the vicissitudes of, feeling like we're being pressured to do this, pressured to do that, pressured to do that. It's like, no. I mean, we're just sort of reflecting the world that is. And, I think it's critically important, that we do these things because our ethical language lives in our popular culture. And if we don't consider that, then we're not considering the potential harm of having a narrow vocabulary in our ethical language.
I love that. Ethical language lives in our pop culture. I'm writing it down.
So sometimes you're looking at a mirror, to what you're going through. And then sometimes you're looking at a window to what you can become. Right. And so, for like, take Batman, for instance. So Bruce Wayne was kind of both, right? The mirror was, I'm sad, he's sad. The window is, this is what you can do with that sadness, right? Bond was incredibly important to me growing up, right? And I kind of grew up in the Moore era. Connery's I found later, but, when I was younger, it was always Roger Moore, Bond, James Bond. Right. Like that was the thing. And it was like, oh, so you have to be polite and you have to do the right thing and you have to save people and you have to have a sense of humor. Right. And so all these things left an impression on me, just kind of like, okay, I think I get how to grow up, and I sort of sacrificed my teenage years, knowing that like, Bryan, you're not really going to find your stride until you're 35.
You knew that as a teenager.
I absolutely, Susan.
Oh, interesting.
I just do. I just gave up. I gave up on adolescence. I was like, I don't understand how any of this works. I'm going to read Esquire magazine. I'm going to read Ian Fleming books. But it wasn't only enlightening for my own life, Susan. It was also, it gave me kind of a window into other aspects of my life. For instance, like Cagney and Lacey, you mentioned, so you have Sharon Gless, Time Daily. Now, in my TV viewing, there was sort of like a slide, right? Like, so the stuff that kids would be interested in happens first. That's when you get your Riptides and Knight Riders and A-Teams and the rest of it. And then the grown-up shows start to happen a little bit later when you're yawning, but you don't want to go to sleep and you've got that little television in your room and you're keeping it going. And so I'd watch a lot of Cagney and Lacey. And I didn't understand most of it.
Yeah, it's very adult. Like looking back, I realized like how adult it is in terms of it's more Hill Street Blues than,
Oh, it's super adult. Like in the opening credit sequence when the flasher guy opens up the thing, and then they make the funny faces. I had no idea what he was doing for like 3 years until I realized like, oh, that was a flasher. I didn't really get what that was. But I could recognize an emotional parallel between what Cagney and Lacey were doing as characters and what my mother was doing in a way. it sort of felt the same, like the same kind of emotional battles, the same kind of things. And I didn't really recognize it consciously, but like subconsciously, it gave me a window into what her experience might be like taking care of me and doing all of that, and it was like a glimpse into adulthood, which I think is a lot of how children get the first sense of adulthood and adulthood's terms is through media. Yeah. Because you're not going to be in the room during adult conversations normally. You're not going to be involved in these things. But when you're watching 30-something because you have a crush on Mel Harris, which I do and still do, and then you're seeing, these like different sort of nuances going on, between adults, it doesn't all land, but it gives you an idea of what grown-ups are kind of going through, and TV was a real window into that for me.
Have you had an opportunity recently to go back and take another look at some of those shows, those formative shows for you from back in the 80s?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's kind of hard to know Rich Haddam and not revisit late 70s and 80s era television, I have to say. Although on my own accord, I watch and rewatch Miami Vice. So that is just something I always do, because I love that. But yeah, I have gone back and seen them. And then, now as a student of film and culture and all that, I can look at Hill Street Blues and see the link to the French Connection in it. I can okay, so this is a little bit of a Freakonomics take, but it's got, this emotionality that's in there and the rest of it. And then sometimes there are things that you saw when you were a kid that had moments that like burned into you emotionally. And you didn't really catch all of what was going on, but you got to go back and you got to revisit it. So there's a lot of little moments like that I remember growing up. Like I have a very vivid memory of the scene where Mark Harmon takes a drunk Bruce Willis and takes him back to his apartment and sits him down. And even though they're both in love with Maddie and Bruce is mad at him, Mark Harmon's character isn't mad at him. And I was like, oh, Bruce is mad, but Mark isn't. He's not really a bad guy. Like that stuck in my mind. Or Daniel J. Travanti and Connie Selica in that movie. I think it was Adam.
Yeah.
They were both in that movie, Adam. And it was the moment where Travanti finds out, Adam Walsh playing Adam Walsh. Adam Walsh finds out that his son has died and has been killed. And I just remember like Travanti like grabbing a mattress or something and emoting in this powerful way. And I just hadn't really seen a man do that on screen before. And I remember that being incredibly affecting, and so I do revisit this stuff all the time. It's weird, these things that just kind of lock themselves into your mind, like that one episode of 21 Jump Street where Hanson's girlfriend gets shot in the convenience store. And Hanson, played by Johnny Depp, couldn't save her. And it was like, I forgot the exact number, but he had gotten the security footage of her shooting. And he recognized that there was about 2.5 seconds or something that he would have had to do something different. And within the episode, you see Hanson making a list of all the different things you can do in 2.5 seconds. Wow. You can take off your shoes. You can do this. You can do that. And there's a scene where Holly Robinson Pete now, was like kind of consoling him through all of this, right? And so maybe I saw the episode once or twice, but it doesn't leave you, And so, yeah, so sometimes I'll revisit it and be like, I need to rewatch this to kind of understand exactly what the context of this was, sort of remaster it, and kind of take it out of the deep viscera of it all, and then kind of revisit and see what's going on. So, yeah, I do it quite a bit.
So were you finding that those emotional moments that you were describing, did they still hit you? Maybe not in the same way, but at least in some deep way this time around, or on a rewatch as they did the first time around?
They did, because, there was, so if you look at like, 50s and 60s television, you still kind of have the theatrical presentation of drama largely. You had some of your kind of edgier works that, started to kind of push the envelope a little bit. And then when you go into the late 70s, that's when folks like Michael Mann were starting in TV, right? And Michael Mann was working on Vegas and all these. And so the naturalism kind of comes in. And the 80s was a really interesting nexus of naturalism and style.
Yes, I agree with that for sure.
And so the moments still work because they're presented in like a 70s method way, but there was a little bit more heightened style on top of the whole affair. And I think they're still like largely effective. I mean, the acting within a lot of those shows is still really, really great.
A lot of emotional journeys in those 80s shows that I think are weirdly still resonant.
Yeah. I mean, the stories still work largely. And it's a lot of first love stuff. Like, my experience with Law was watching LA Law. That was like, okay, I guess that's what being a lawyer is like. You have to be really good looking. and then you have to get some wisdom from Richard Dysart.
Yes.
And then you can go do a thing, right? And so like Victor Fuentes was like, okay, I guess that's what you do, right? That's how you be a lawyer. Even like Hunter, right? Like, and it was Dee Dee McCall. Like on its surface, it's just, a cop show and she has to go undercover. I think she went undercover as a hooker like maybe 7 too many times over the course of that season.
Yeah, they did that.
That was like Dee Dee's go-to game was like, she's going to walk the streets and then she's going to whip out the silver 38. But there is a lot of really good, like fresh banter going on, in there. And there's a real crack to a lot of those scripts, that I kind of wish we had more of that today.
Well, Hunter has come up a lot because, and the actress is Stephanie Kramer, and the relationship between Hunter and Dee Dee McCall has come up a lot as a working relationship, male-female, that is less romantic and more professional and friendship.
Sure.
And that's unusual, I think, both at the time, but even now.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. There always seems to be some push towards making the male and female lead have some sort of romantic relationship. And most of the time I'm like, do we really need this? Let's just,
Right.
But anyway.
Right.
Well, you write comics and television and features. Is it in terms of storytelling and in terms of approach? Do you come at them differently? Do you in terms of trying to figure out story for each of those kinds of things?
It's a very good question. I mean, in certain ways, storytelling is storytelling, right? So in the larger philosophical sense, the work is about the same. I think the real difference is the level of economy that you have to use. So a screenplay, anywhere usually between 110 pages, maybe 130, 140 if you're working on one of those important films. But you have a lot of pages. And you have a lot of scenes. Scenes still have to be efficient and all of that, but you have a little bit more time. TV, I find, is much less time, because you have to almost deliver a emotionally resonant feature level experience in literally half the space. So I think your scenes have to accomplish more things in television than they do in a movie. Like when I'm watching a movie, what I'm struck by is that scene was only about one thing. And I'm like, I can't ever do that in a TV script. Every scene has to do multiple things at the same time. I can't just have, a scene where Moneypenny comes to Bond and plays a video from M and that's the whole scene. No, that has to also be about this thing and setting up this character thing and paying off the last episode and the rest of it. So it's economy. And then a comic book, it's even more economy because you only have 20 pages and about 5 panels of artwork, 5 images per page to push that story forward, right? So it's you have to be even more efficient and more targeted about what you do. But one of the reasons why I really love writing comics is working in that efficiency matrix makes it easier, for me at least, to accomplish more, I think, in a television script. And a television script makes it easier for me to accomplish more in a feature. Because you're sort of used to having to do all that. So I think that is the largest difference in the art forms. But, I write visually, in all of them. I'm a visual thinker. So, that's kind of carried through. But yeah, I think that's what it is. It's really just about how long do I have to create the experience is the big question between all those forms.
When you have an idea, though, do you know going in which way where it's going to be? Is it going to be a comic, a TV show, or something else? Or does that sort of come as you begin to work through what the story is actually going to be?
Good question. Unfortunately, a lot of that decision making is also encumbered by business strategy, frankly, right? More about viability. Is this idea more viable as a comic or a television idea or a film idea? All of that. Rarely do I just get to sit and just sort of think format agnostic and sort of feel it out that way. It's usually a conversation with my reps, with some friends, sort of figuring that all out. Now, there are some things that I think just work better as a comic book because either they're far too expensive to try to write as a screenplay or a television idea, or they're just so visually driven that you want to direct them on the page, because the imagery is how the story is being told. For those kinds of things where I think the imagery is really part of the experience. And I kind of view myself like Rich is a master writer. He's an excellent writer. I am not. I'm a pretty good writer who can also design an emotional experience. So experiential design is really what I do, I think. And writing is a part of that. But sometimes the experience I'm trying to create is just better served by having something that has images associated with it rather than living in the theater of the mind. So that also kind of comes to bear when I'm making these choices. And then oftentimes a comic book for me will be a palate cleanser. I just got done working on a thing here. I'm working on this huge movie for Universal right now. I can't talk about the details of it, but
we won't get to it later, but it's fine.
It's enormous, right? And it's got cultural importance and all of those things that, you say you want to do when you come to Hollywood. And I love working on it, but it takes skin, bone and marrow and blood to kind of get this thing going. So, working on a comic book for Marvel, just helps me create and keep myself productive, but just kind of get out of the Olympic level kind of pressure from that process. Just be like, here's a yarn about a superhero who stops a bad guy, right? So a lot of that is also kind of like governs what I do, how I do it.
And where does Titans fit in? I'm just curious about your experience on Titans because it's been...
Titans, it's interesting because I came in very new to television. I'd only done one season of a show, Ash vs. Evil Dead, which wasn't an intensely dramatic show because we didn't have much time. Half-hour runtime. You have to have 2 demon fights every episode. So you basically had 4 pages where people talk to each other. We had a lovely showrunner, Mark Verheiden, who I think is amazing, who should be on the show too, actually. Because Mark is a brilliant guy. He's been working forever. And he knows a lot of these folks. Like he's talking to me about Virginia Madsen the other day. Like he's that guy. I love
Virginia Madsen.
He's got all the anecdotes, right? And Mark's a lovely guy. And so I loved working on the show, but I only had a season of that. And then I went to Titans. And so that was the first hour-long show I'd ever worked on. Deep serialization, I was familiar with the comic book stuff, but also I'm more of a Batman guy than I am a Titans guy. So I had a decent familiarity, but I didn't have the fluency that I have with like Batman.
Well, I was going to say, but you've written for DC
yes.
Comics. Okay, too. But yeah, I understand.
But that's a huge pantheon. DC Comics is everything from, lawyers, superheroes. Well, it's more Marvel, it's Daredevil, but like it's everything from like super grounded stuff to like very cosmic, whatever. So, and I sort of worked in the more like kind of Gotham-y, it could be possible for 2 weeks, maybe, kind of space rather than the high fantastic. But it was great. I got to kind of learn. I was pretty useless the first season of Titans, to be honest. I was doing more learning than I was contributing. And everyone was very patient with me, I think. But I think as the series went on, I started to find my sea legs a bit. And, like I said, like you grow through these processes. And since I've been on this thing for 4 or 5 years, absorbing everyone's technique, which I think is the biggest benefit of being in a writer's room, is you get to see how other people solve problems. And then that can go into your toolbox because everyone comes at something from a different perspective, right? And that's kind of hard to do when you're just on your own writing a screenplay, sort of shift your point of view. So that was really helpful, and it's it's been really rewarding. But speaking to what we were talking about earlier, one of my focus points in working on Titans is making sure the female characters, I think, have dimension and agency. I don't want to say strong female character because I don't know what that means, but like very human female characters that have shades and flaws and strengths and the rest of it. I'm very focused on it. And I think that's because of a lot of the stuff I saw when I was growing up, growing up on David and Maddie, growing up on Kate Jackson, on various television shows. Some actors I would just follow from show to show to show, right? So it's like Charlie's Angels reruns and then Scarecrow and Mrs. King, you know what I mean? Like that kind of thing. And it all goes into the mind, goes into the heart. And so now we're working on TV. It's kind of hard to get that stuff out of your mind in execution. And so I do pay a lot of attention to that just to make sure that these characters, I think, hold up to the kind of experiences I had when I was growing up, so on and so forth.
That is okay. We want to keep talking. We're going to take a short break.
Sure.
But we'll be back with more. Okay, we're back.
So I had a comic book I wrote called 7 Days from Hell that was like Ian Fleming meets Rod Serling, basically. Not going to get into the story of it all, but it was like a metaphysical spy thriller kind of thing. Wrote the adaptation of it as a screenplay. On my own, I just kind of spec'd out, as we say in the business, because I had a vision for it, and did a couple drafts of that, floated around, and it got to Pierce Brosnan. Because his producing partner at the time, Bo St. Clair, who passed away a few years ago, she was so lovely. It got to her. She read it and she was like, "Oh, I think Pierce would really like this." I showed him. So she showed it to him, I think, and I don't know if he read all the way through it or what have you, but he wanted to meet me personally. We went all the way up to Malibu. I'd never been to Malibu before, right? And so I'd never seen that side of Los Angeles. I'd seen the Tony Scott Los Angeles. I'd seen the Martin Brest Beverly Hills Cop Los Angeles, but Malibu was different.
Yeah.
Right. That was like Aaron Spelling, this is where the gajillionaires live.
Yep.
Right? And so I'm going into Malibu, going to some private club or something to meet Pierce Brosnan. I'm nearly shaking in my Nikes. I walk into this place, feel totally out of place because I'm just in this private club. Why am I here? That kind of thing. I get to the table and I see Pierce, and he's sitting next to Vijay Armitage, the tennis pro, who was also in Octopussy. Right? Now, Octopussy was a Moore film, but apparently Pierce and Vijay are friends.
Once you're in the Bond world, they just hang out. It's just like you're all on a text chain.
Yeah. And not only am I sitting down with Remington Steele, Thomas Crown, James Bond, right? There's also Vijay Armitage, who, if it was just a tennis pro, he's an amazing tennis player. But on top of that, he was an Octopussy. And I can barely handle myself. So I sit at this table, and Pierce sees that I'm kind of nervous. And he's so gentle. He's like, I think he said something like, "Do you need a few minutes to get through the Bond thing?" And I said, "I need 10. And so he talked to my manager for a bit, and then I rejoined the conversation, and everyone was laughing. But I told Pierce that when I was 11 years old, I used to watch Remington Steele religiously. I thought he was the coolest guy on TV, and I would try to act like him. So one of the things I would do is I would kind of lean back and put my finger against my temple like this. An 11-year-old boy sitting like this that I absolutely picked up from Pierce Brosnan and Remington Steele. And he had a good laugh at that. And I made James Bond laugh. And it doesn't matter that movie went nowhere. I mean, I could have literally been kicked out of Hollywood 5 minutes later, and I would have had no regrets.
That's fantastic.
No.
Oh my gosh.
I once got to pitch a project to Jodie Foster, and it was pretty friggin' amazing. The
Oh,
only
man.
thing that was terrifying about it was that we were in her office. The heat, the air conditioning broken, so it was 1,000 degrees, and she had a big giant stand up of Anthony Hopkins from Silence of the Lambs right in her office, staring at me
No.
during the entire pitch. It was really.
I bet she's lovely, right?
She was absolutely lovely. She was absolutely
Yeah.
lovely.
She
She was brilliant
that's the sense
and
I would
lovely.
get. Yeah.
She like totally got everything. She had questions that were really smart and but very but not in a attack way and in a like, oh my God, so this happens and that, like, it was absolutely the height of a lot of things. And yeah, it was great.
Yeah, I don't know many people who've told me Jodie Foster stories, but I've never heard a bad Jodie Foster story. I just hear that she's just amazing.
I walked in a big fan and walked out probably a bigger fan.
Those are always the best, much better than the alternative. I've had those too, but I won't share those in the podcast. We'll do that later
Well, that's
over
a different
wine.
podcast.
Yes,
and
yeah.
That's a party later.
Who not to meet with Bryan Hill.
Oh my God, we definitely need that. All right, I want to talk about Titans and the female characters on Titans for a minute.
Well, first, I have to give full credit to the female writers that we've had on the show over these years, right? Like, season 1, we had Gab Stanton, who's amazing,
Love
who should be
her.
on this podcast.
We're going to get her on the podcast.
Because she's just an amazing human being in every way. One could define the word amazing. And so that always helps because you have someone who really understands the experience from the center to add to it. And then we also pay a lot of attention to the actors. I'm very grateful that I've always had a decent relationship with the cast. Even during season 1, whether it was Tegan, who's very young, she was about 15 or 16, I think, when I started.
When you
working on
guys
the
started,
show.
yeah, she was very young.
Yeah. And Anna Diop, who plays Starfire, she was a little older. I'm still very young, but old enough to go into a bar and order a drink. But like very friendly. And for me, it was really about harnessing the experience of the people in the room who've lived through these experiences, listening to the actors who play these characters, thinking about them and what they want to explore on screen, and then kind of filtering that in with my knowledge of the characters from the comics and how we could realize them inside the vision of the showrunner, Greg Walker, which is different than an exact replica of the comic books. But it was really just a couple things, just kind of making sure that every character, but especially the female characters, weren't acquisitions. They weren't, there to be rescued or there to be oogled at and, and all of those things, and just making sure that they had layers, right? Like before I kind of gave the Heisman Trophy arm to the phrase strong female character. And I do that because I think that can lead to very one-dimensional writing. And instead of like, well, she has a gun, she shoots somebody, or she has laser beams and she'll use them and she looks cool in her outfit, so we don't have to write her anymore because she's strong. Instead, it's just the layering of it all. And thinking about the emotional consequence of things. But a lot of that just comes from the real-time human feedback. And we also have a showrunner who is open and amenable to that kind of exploration, which is critical, right? Because there's nothing we can do on the show that the showrunner, can't stop us from exploring, right? And so you need a leader who says, "Yeah, I want more of that. I want to go deeper there. We can do more with this character in this moment, and those things. There's a certain inherent amount of aesthetic style to these things. The outfits are very tight
For everybody. It is equal
for everybody,
opportunity.
right? There's an equal opportunity oogling going on with all these things, right? So that is an element of it. But I love the collaboration. I love working with people and getting their experience that I don't have. When I was on Evil Dead, I was sitting in my little writer's office, just a staff writer, as lowly as one can be while still writing a script. And I hear this beautiful voice ask me if I knew where the pretzels were. And I turn around and it's Lucy Lawless just standing there in the doorway, right? And so I remembered how to breathe. and then I was like, Miss Lawless, I can take you to the pretzels. And she's like, just call me Lucy. I'm not even going to try to do her accent. It's mellifluous and beautiful. And then so I showed her where the pretzels were, and we just had this long conversation, about 15-minute conversation, but it was, kind of wide ranging, like her experience as like an actor and then doing stunts and the rest of it. And it all goes in somehow into the subconscious and comes back out. So I hope that, the work that we do that comes out on screen is really evocative of the real kind of family aspect of the show, and how we're all paying attention to one another. And ultimately, we want everyone to do their best work. And that's, kind of what I'm focused on all of the time. And because I'm a James Cameron kid, and all of that, I have absolutely no problem with letting a woman run things in a genre story.
When it's all the Titans, I think of season 2 and 3, 4 of the 8 Titans were women, which
true.
Again, in the superhero collective shows, that doesn't always happen.
It doesn't always happen, but there are a lot of interesting female characters within comics.
Yes.
Now, it's getting better now, but for decades, there weren't many women that were writing books. There's a wonderful writer, Ann Nocenti, who did a lot of work on Daredevil, who I think is like super awesome and open and all of that. And she might be an interesting guest on the show too. And wonderful. And so there have been, Gail Simone has been there for a long time. Gail's also a wonderful person, and she's in some writing, but it hasn't been as balanced that way in terms of who's creating the stories. But in terms of the characters, there have been a lot of characters, and maybe some of these characters started as male fantasy. True. Wonder Woman kind of started as like a bondage thing wrapped in an American flag, right? Like
right, but the true story of Wonder Woman is
it's insane.
Crazy.
Yeah, it's bananas.
But that's another podcast. Go ahead.
But these characters are a bit like clay, right? And they travel between the hands of storytellers, and hopefully everyone is kneading out some of the bubbles as they go along, right? And so, as the clay passes through different people, some of those unfortunate aspects are worked out and more interesting things are worked in, and they look at like Kelly Sue DeConnick's work on Wonder Woman recently with an artist, Phil Jimenez, which is brilliant stuff, right? So there's a lot of these really interesting characters that are there, that have this great backstories, great character conflicts, and all that. So I grew up steeped in that stuff. That's why I've always been mystified at the resistance to women leading a genre story, or any of these kind of gendered aspects of this stuff, because that just wasn't my experience growing up. Like growing up, like you went to rent Conan the Barbarian, and if they didn't have it, you rented Red Sonja and you were happy about it. I think, this is film, but I think to like Dune, and Chani working with Paul in the David Lynch film, Sean Young, doing all the cool adventure-y things, right? Like, so it really tripped me up when I got out here, because I was writing all these female-driven genre pieces. That was my library coming out to Hollywood. I just had tons of them I was doing, and I would get this weird resistance sometimes. I'm just like, but this stuff is already happening all over the place. So I'm glad to see that one of the aspects of comics is we do get now these female characters that have agency, and because they're being developed and written and filmed by really thoughtful creators, Matt's Catwoman is a lot more than just a fetching young woman in a skin-tight outfit. Even though I would argue that Michelle Pfeiffer's Catwoman was also a lot more.
I would too. We could go on for days about that. I would love to come live with you in your big mansion and stay with you, whatever, but I just couldn't live with myself. That line has stayed with me since the moment I saw it. Okay, but go on.
Well, it's like kind of quietly feminist. Batman Returns. Yeah. And it's got like shades of Working Girl in it a little bit, right? So going kind of back to where we are, I was really awkward growing up. I was terribly awkward. So one of the things I would do to like learn charisma, basically, would be to mimic characters from shows. And so I picked up mimicry when I was a kid, just to kind of find things to say and how to relate to people. And then later on, I used to watch a lot of stand-up comedy. And I would sort of study it because I knew that if I could make people laugh, then I could disarm situations a little bit. It seemed like something I need to learn how to do. So I watched a lot of stand-up comedians, and this is how weird I was. I would watch their sets and I would remember their jokes, and then I would tell the jokes to myself in the bedroom. And then if I was watching like Rich Little or, Eddie Murphy would do impressions on occasion. I watched a lot of the roasts. So like Billy Crystal.
I remember those, those were aired. They were huge.
Yep.
I used to watch all of those to kind of figure it out, right? But it all started with me getting over my social anxiety. I used to stutter really badly when I was a kid. And I think it was more of a psychological thing, probably a holdover from my dad's death. The brain does weird things with trauma, right? And I couldn't, I thought I couldn't, but I got over it. But yeah, it was rough. So everything, that's why I'm always out there on social media telling people, don't give up, keep moving forward, work on yourself, gain success in degrees, because everything that people may think I'm good at, I was terrible at for a while, right? People are like, Bryan, you speak so well. Well, I didn't always. And writing was difficult for me. Like so many things were difficult. And so I don't think I'm a person that was born with talent. I think my talent is I don't quit, right? Like that's where I think my talent lives, is it's nearly impossible to get me to quit. I don't give up. I don't give up on people, and I don't give up on tasks. And that might result in acquiring skills, but I don't think I came out of the womb gifted artistically or anything like that. I kind of wrestled myself into it through the sheer force of will. So education's incredibly important to me. I was a scholarship kid growing up. I didn't have very much money. So I was able to go to a high school where all the kids had a lot of money. Now, it made me miserable the entire time because I was ashamed and the rest of it and dealing with all the things you deal with when you're the poorest kid in your school. But what it did give me was the proximity to successful people. And it demystified success. When I got to Hollywood, I realized oh, this is just another high school. I know how to do this now. It was like going back to my high school with the skills of adulthood, understanding people's archetypes again, how to do that. So I think education is important in two equal ways. One, you have the academic aspects of it, the acquisition of information, the regurgitation of information with a sprinkle of active problem solving. Critically important. But what you also need is a social education.
Yeah, I love that. I coming out to LA to go to film school at 17 from Georgia was a very cultural and social shift that I was very unprepared for. You're like, I'm on a different planet.
Absolutely. That's why I love Bond movies so much, because being in this business feels like being James Bond.
Yeah, you're ported in and you got to solve a problem.
You're ported in. There's a bunch of rich, dangerous people who want to destroy you, and you have to accomplish a goal without getting destroyed in the process. I think watching Casino Royale is excellent training for working in Hollywood.
And whatever you do, don't get caught in the wrong room with the wrong person.
Because they won't save you.
Exactly.
Because you are on your own when you're out there. So it is up to you to get yourself back safely.
All right, let's talk about some of the projects you're working on besides Titans.
Yeah. I wrote an issue of Black Panther. I'm working on, like I said before, this enormous film for Universal, which, without giving away details, it's romantic. It interfaces with music in a way that's very important to me. It's sort of a dual coming of age story. It's progressive in a lot of ways that matter to me philosophically, and I'm very, very excited about it. One of the things that I haven't really been able to access in most of my work has been romance, love stories, even like sexuality. Not really a lot. I haven't been able to do that much, because I do comic book work largely. So I'm hyper excited about that one. I have a horror project I'm working on that is brewing, and cross my fingers, I should be directing a feature soon. So
Ooh.
more to hear about that. But yeah, that is most of what I can say. Yeah. One of the reasons why I do a lot of different things is I never really have to obsess about the fate of any one thing.
Yes.
Because I have some other thing I do, right? The penalty for that is I don't sleep. I just have to keep moving forward and keep creating and remaining prolific. We'll see how it goes.
Oh my gosh. It has been such a pleasure talking with you. Where can
This has been
people
so much
find
fun.
you?
Well, as long as it's operating, you can find me on Twitter at Bryan Edward Hill, Bryan with a Y. That's where I'm most active on social media. I'm fairly dubious of social media. I tend to think that social media is this generation's cigarette.
Yeah.
Like 15 years from now, we're going to be like, why did we let children use this? We were crazy people who let children use this, right? But here we are. So there's Twitter at Bryan Edward Hill. You can also find me on Instagram at Bryan E. Hill. I have a YouTube that's called The Hill Administration. I rarely post videos there, but I do have some videos about writing and also the psychology of kind of getting through the business and dealing with some of the self-doubt issues, imposter syndrome, things I've wrestled with before. So there might be value there on YouTube. But those are the ways to and you can also shine the bat signal and I'll show up. But
Good to know.
not everyone has a bat signal.
Not everyone has a bat signal. And if you call
Right.
for the Roger Moore Bond, that's
Yeah,
when you come to.
right. And then there's a special phone. It rings right to me, and but those are more difficult for people to access. Maybe just stick with Twitter.
I will say that on Twitter, I've thoroughly enjoyed following you, and I really find your advice incredibly prescient and helpful.
Well, that warms the heart, Susan. I don't know what to do with it, but I try to be positive.
Yes, that's all we can be.
I'm just gonna be a positive guy online. Keep the cycle of abundance flowing.
Yes. Oh my gosh. Well, thank you. This has been a real pleasure.
Thank you so much. This has been wonderful.
Thank you, Bryan. This has been
If
great.
Jane Badler comes on, I'm coming.
We're calling you.
All right.
Come do it in person.
Okay.
All right. For today's audiography, you can follow Bryan at Bryan Edward Hill, and that's Bryan with a Y, on Twitter, and at Bryan E. Hill, also with a Y, on Instagram, and at The Hill Administration on YouTube. And if you want to check out some of his comic books, I recommend American Carnage and Angel and Spike, Black Panther, and Chariot. And you can find a link to some of these in our website.
And if you'd like to know more about American TV comic books, there's a book by Peter Bosch called American TV Comic Books, 1940s to 1980s, from the small screen to the printed page.
Dear listeners, we had some of your listener questions that have come in over time for Eugenie Ross Lemming, who we interviewed back in season 1 on episode 4. So we wrote to Eugenie and got answers back for some of these questions. So one of the first questions we had was, did she and Brad have any special touches, tricks, rules they would use when writing Amanda King and Lee Stetson scenes? And we had a couple of questions in that direction. And this is what she had to say about that. We were marrying two realities, suburban mom with James Bond, fish out of water. But often, instead of Amanda being the fish, we put Lee in the odd situation where he didn't fit and had no skills. He would pick up a flamingo lawn decoration and duel with it because he had no spy gadgets available. Her common sense complemented his training in arcane stuff, so she didn't always mess up and need saving. Sometimes he needed her to lead the way.
That's awesome. That's
Yeah.
awesome to hear. And
I thought that was really great.
yeah, and I think they did a very good job of carrying that through.
Yes.
The whole series. So that's great to know where it all began. Next question. The show's blend of action, comedy, romance feels like a nod to classic films. Like if Charade, North by Northwest, and Bringing Up Baby had a baby. A screwball noir, if you will. Were there any films or television shows that inspired this show? What was the tone you and Brad wanted for the show? Eugenie said, Hitchcock's The Lady Vanishes or Victorious were inspirational. The predicament of an innocent swept up in a world of danger, excitement, and intrigue. But our style was more contemporary and less arch.
I love that answer too. And then we got a question about the fun theme song. If there were any, neat little tidbits about the fun theme song by Arthur Rubinstein when we did our music podcast. And Eugenie said, we hoped for a grander than TV, more like a film score. We played Bernard Herrmann for our composer, Arthur, as an example, and wanted Bernard Herrmann, but with more of a wink. And he wanted to create a theme for Amanda and another more heroic theme for Lee and marry the two.
I don't know about you, but when I hear that theme song, it stays with me for days. It just will keep rolling over in my head, out of my control.
Because it's fun to be a spy, and it's fun to be a mom. It's fun to be a mom and a spy.
It really is a great theme song.
It really is.
I miss theme songs.
All right,
as we've discussed before.
Yes. Thank you, Eugenie, for sending us those answers. Keep your questions coming, listeners, and we'll try to get them answered from whoever we can.
Absolutely.
Whoever will still talk to us after this. Hey, Sharon, you know what else?
What?
We won 3 podcast awards.
I know we did, didn't we?
Guys, we don't know how it happened, but somehow they gave us 3 podcast awards from the People's Choice Podcast Awards. Thank you, voters. Thank you, listeners. Thank you to our entire crew. We won Best Art Podcast, Best TV and Film Podcast,
and Best Female Host Podcast, which I think is the one that I like the best out of all 3 of them. Listen, I'll take any of them. I never expected we'd win any of them, let alone all 3 of the ones we were nominated for. So it's really amazing.
It's really great. Congratulations to all the winners. You can go over to podcastawards.com and check out the streaming awards show and see all the winners and all the nominees. And there are really great podcasts in there. I also want to shout out our team. I want to thank Sharon, you right there, for joining me on this crazy podcast journey that's now an award-winning crazy podcast journey. I want to thank Melissa Roth, our producer, Kevin Ducey, our sound engineer and editor. You guys have been on from the very beginning. I want to thank the 90s TV babies, Sergio Perez, Sarita Fontanesi, and Megan Rubel. And I want to shout out Sullivan and Sean from Concept Marketing and all of our amazing guests and all of our amazing, fabulous listeners. Thank you, guys. We're thrilled.
And frankly, none of this would be happening without Susan. She's the one that came up with the idea, that invited us all to go on this journey with her, this incredible, amazing journey with her. So, Susan, it all begins and ends with you. So thank you.
Thank you. Aww.
Yay. And don't forget, Richard. Don't forget.
Oh, I won't forget Richard Haddam.
Okay.
I thank him every day. But thank you, Richard Haddam. Because, yes, we wouldn't be here without Richard Haddam, one of our original guests and a co-producer on this podcast. Thank you for listening to 80s TV Ladies. Please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform. We're on all of them: Spotify, Google Podcasts, Good Pods. Search 80s TV Ladies and tell your friends. Be sure to tune in for our next episode and listen to all the previous ones if you're just joining us.
We hope 80s TV Ladies brings you joy and laughter and lots of fabulous new and old shows to watch, all of which will lead us forward toward being amazing ladies of the 21st century.
Let's go.
Thanks for listening.